It was a typical Tuesday morning in May when newly appointed Police Chief Malik Davis arrived at his precinct, but not in the way anyone expected. Today was going to be different. For the people working in the precinct, it was just another day of processing paperwork, reviewing case files, and preparing for the upcoming shift. But little did they know, today would bring an unexpected shift of its own. Malik, a man who had spent 2 decades in law enforcement and worked his way to the top, was about to take command, but he wasn't going to announce himself in a formal press conference or with a parade of greetings. No, Malik Davis had a plan. He wanted to see how things truly operated in the precinct, unfiltered, without the facade of politeness that came with his position. And what better way to do that than to blend in? To walk in as just another man, unnoticed and undistinguished from the rest of the officers. Malik had chosen to show up dressed casually, a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. He didn't look like the powerful leader he was about to become. He didn't look like the man who would soon have the power to change the department and hold officers accountable for their actions. Instead, he looked like just another man on the street. But that was precisely his plan. As he entered the parking lot of the precinct, he could hear the hum of officers arriving for work, a few of them exchanging jokes, others rushing to get inside. No one noticed Malik, not yet. His appearance was only a few days old in the department, and his face wasn't as familiar to the team. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself as he walked toward the building. The weight of the change he was about to make felt heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't just coming in to lead, he was coming in to reset the culture, to clean up the mess that had been growing for years, to tackle the systemic issues that were keeping the department from truly serving the community. As he walked through the entrance, the noise of ringing phones, the rustling of paperwork, and the chatter of officers filled the air. The precinct looked the same as any other. The floors were shiny, the walls lined with bulletin boards and missing persons posters. It was a place where routine took place every single day, and that was about to change. Malik wasn't trying to stir up trouble just yet. He simply wanted to watch. He moved through the corridors quietly, observing the behavior around him. Officers stood near desks, some talking among themselves, others engrossed in paperwork. No one gave him a second glance. That's just how it was. He was invisible, just another face among the many. That is, until he passed the break room. He noticed a group of officers clustered around, laughing loudly. Their voices carried across the hallway, and Malik stopped for a moment. Something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't the joking or the laughter. It was the tone, the undercurrent of disrespect. Just as Malik was about to step forward, he heard someone call out sharply, "Hey, you!" A voice barked from the break room. Malik turned to see a white officer, his arms crossed, swaggering toward him. Officer Daniels, his badge read. Behind him, a few other officers snickered. They looked ready to enjoy the scene about to unfold. Malik didn't react immediately. He stood still, waiting for the officer to reach him. "Lost, are we?" Daniels sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't a homeless shelter, buddy. Get out of here." Malik felt a tightening in his chest. The words stung, but he didn't show it. Instead, he remained calm, making eye contact with the officer, but Daniels didn't give him a chance to respond. "You heard me," Daniels went on, his tone more aggressive now. "We don't need people like you hanging around here." The laughter from the officers behind Daniels echoed down the hallway. It felt as if Malik were being weighed down by their eyes. He could feel their gaze, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to show weakness. But Malik was determined. He kept his posture steady, breathing slowly. Daniels leaned in closer, his face inches from Malik's. Without warning, the officer spat directly into Malik's face. The room went silent. Time seemed to freeze for just a moment. The warmth of the spit on Malik's skin, the way it trickled down his cheek, all of it felt surreal. Around him, the laughter continued, louder now, but Malik didn't flinch. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face with slow precision. His heart was pounding, but he stayed composed. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Malik asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniels smirked, his eyes glinting with the belief that he had control over the situation. "Only people who don't belong here," he said, his grin widening. But Malik didn't let it slide. He could have let the insult pass, but something deep inside told him he needed to act. Without a word, he turned and walked away. His steps were deliberate, measured, as he made his way down the hallway toward the briefing room. An intercom crackled to life as Malik reached the door. It was time for the briefing. As Malik entered the briefing room, the atmosphere inside felt like the calm before the storm. Officers sat in their usual spots, some carrying coffee mugs, others chatting about the shift, all unaware of the storm brewing outside their door. The meeting had yet to begin, and the usual casual banter filled the room. It wasn't anything unusual for a police precinct, just a normal morning for the men and women who worked here. But as Malik stepped into the room, a subtle shift took place. He walked in with his head held high, but no one recognized him. The only thing they saw was a man in casual clothes who had entered to listen to the morning briefing. It wasn't until he stood at the back of the room that the air in the room began to thicken. Captain Harris, the senior officer, stood at the front of the room, preparing the briefing. His voice cut through the noise, demanding attention. "All right, settle down, everyone," Captain Harris called, his voice firm but friendly. "We've got a special announcement today. Listen up." The room quieted, and the officers took their seats. Some exchanged curious glances, wondering what was coming. The room felt charged with anticipation. Daniels, who was still in a corner, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. He had no idea what was about to happen. Captain Harris continued, "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last week. We've all been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce our new leader." The room remained silent. The officers looked up, expecting a routine introduction. But no one knew what was coming next. Not yet. Harris cleared his throat. "This morning, we welcome Chief Malik Davis." Malik stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. The room fell completely silent as he walked toward the podium. There were no handshakes, no smiles, just a heavy silence that filled the air. The officers stared, some surprised, others unsure of what to think. Malik placed a file on the podium, the seal of the precinct clear for all to see. He took a moment to survey the room, letting the tension build. His calm demeanor made the silence even more deafening. Daniels, whose smirk from earlier had now faded, stood frozen, his mouth hanging open as recognition dawned. Malik's voice broke the silence. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Malik Davis, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." The words landed like a bombshell. The room was still. No one moved. The officers exchanged confused glances, trying to process what they had just heard. Malik could see the realization in their eyes, especially Daniels, who now stood with his face drained of color. "You ... Daniels stammered, his voice barely audible. "You're the—" "Yes," Malik responded firmly, his gaze locked on Daniels. "I'm the new chief of police." The silence was thick, oppressive. Malik let the weight of his words sink in. He wasn't just there to lead. He was there to take control, to reshape the culture of the precinct, to restore respect and accountability. And the first order of business? To address what he had witnessed just a few moments ago. Malik didn't waste time. He continued, his voice steady but laced with authority. "When I arrived this morning, I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this precinct for what it truly is, without the filtered lens of the usual meetings or rehearsed greetings," he said, his eyes sweeping over the room. "What I saw this morning was unacceptable. I saw behaviors that should never be tolerated, and that includes the treatment I just received." A murmur rippled through the room as the officers began to understand the connection between the man they had just mocked and the man standing before them now. Daniels's bravado was gone, replaced by a deep sense of unease. Malik paused, his gaze lingering on Daniels. "Officer Daniels," Malik said, his voice cutting through the tension, "when you spat in my face earlier today, you disrespected not just me. You disrespected this badge, this department, and every person in this room." Daniels flinched, his face turning crimson. His body language shrank as he avoided Malik's piercing gaze. He knew he had made a grave mistake, but the damage had already been done. Malik continued, his voice now filled with the weight of years of leadership experience. I don't care who you are or where you come from. Everyone who wears this badge, or anyone who walks through those doors for that matter, deserves respect. That is not negotiable. He turned away from Daniels and addressed the rest of the room. His eyes scanned the officers seated before him, some still processing what had just happened. The next few days at the precinct were filled with uncertainty, tension, and the quiet whispers of officers unsure of what to expect. The status quo had been shattered, and in its place, a new culture was beginning to take root, one where accountability, respect, and integrity weren't just ideals, but mandates. Malik knew the road ahead would be challenging. He'd made his point, but there was still a great deal of work to do. The department wasn't going to change overnight, but today at least, he had made it clear that things would not remain the same. For the next week, Malik walked the halls of the precinct more than anyone had ever seen the previous chief do. He wasn't hiding behind closed doors or sitting in meetings. He was present, visible, and approachable. He made it a point to speak to each officer, asking questions, offering support, and, when necessary, giving guidance. It wasn't just about changing the culture inside the precinct. It was about restoring faith in law enforcement, about rebuilding the trust that had been lost, not only between the officers, but between the department and the community it served. The tension between the officers slowly began to shift. Some officers who had once laughed at Daniels's behavior now stayed clear of him. The group that had once supported him through jokes and ridicule now avoided eye contact, some even muttering apologies to Malik when they passed him in the hall. But not everyone was willing to change. Daniels, who had been suspended following the incident, had not taken kindly to his suspension. He filed an appeal, claiming that his suspension was an overreaction. He even went so far as to say that Malik had overstepped his bounds, but Malik wasn't backing down. During Daniels' suspension, Malik personally reviewed the reports from the internal investigation. The investigation revealed a long history of complaints against Daniels: excessive force, inappropriate behavior, and unprofessional conduct that had gone unchecked for years. The report was a damning indictment of the culture that had allowed officers like Daniels to operate with impunity. Malik stood firm. Daniels' appeal was denied. He would not return to active duty. But Malik also knew that his role as chief wasn't just about disciplining one officer. It was about fostering an environment where no officer felt they could act without consequences. A few weeks later, as Malik sat in his office, he received a call from Captain Harris. It was an unexpected call, one that would change the course of things at the precinct. Chief, Harris said, his voice tentative, I wanted to let you know that things are changing around here. We've seen officers stepping up, speaking up. There's a different energy now. It's working. Malik's eyes narrowed in thought. What do you mean? I'm talking about the culture shift, Harris replied. We've got officers who used to joke about things like Daniel's behavior, now telling new recruits that things are different. They're not standing for it anymore. Malik leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of Harris's words sink in. It wasn't just one or two officers. It was a whole shift in mentality. They were finally seeing the fruits of his labor. That's good, Malik said, his voice soft. But it's just the beginning. We've still got work to do. Of course, Harris agreed. But for the first time in years, people feel like they can speak up. They're willing to do better because they know you've got their back. Malik exhaled, a deep breath filled with both relief and resolve. He wasn't just building a team. He was building a legacy, one where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. It was never going to be easy. Change never is. But Malik was no stranger to hardship. He had spent years fighting against systemic issues, both outside and within the department. He would fight for fairness, and he would ensure his officers did the same. As the weeks passed, the officers who had once mocked Malik, even silently resisted him, began to see the changes for themselves. The department became more disciplined, more professional, and above all, more united. Malik spent his days engaging with the officers, pushing them to be better, to think critically, and to lead with respect. One afternoon, as Malik stood by the window in his office, watching the officers return from their shifts, a young officer named Reyes approached him. "Chief," she said quietly, her eyes filled with sincerity, "I wanted to thank you." Malik turned to face her, his eyebrow raised in curiosity. "For what?" "For showing us what it really means to lead," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of emotion. "I've been in this department for 5 years and I never thought things would change, but they are, and it's because of you." Malik felt a small sense of pride stir within him, but he didn't let it show. He had done what he needed to do. He wasn't here for praise. He was here to get the job done. Still, he gave Reyes a small nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said, "but this isn't just me. This is all of us. We're in this together." Reyes smiled, nodding in agreement before walking away. Malik returned his gaze to the window. The precinct wasn't perfect, but it was better. It was a department where officers were held accountable, where respect was mandatory, and where leadership wasn't defined by power, but by service. Later that evening, as Malik sat at his desk reviewing reports, the phone rang again. It was a call from the community. Malik picked up the phone, expecting it to be another routine complaint or a concern, but the voice on the other end was different. "Are you the new chief?" the voice asked. "Yes," Malik replied. "I just wanted to thank you," the caller said. "My son was pulled over last week. The officer who stopped him was professional, respectful, and he didn't make us feel like we were being targeted. It's the first time in years we've felt safe around the police. Thank you for what you're doing." Malik sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the words sink in. This was the reason he had taken the job: to restore trust, to change the perception, and to create a department that people could rely on. He had made a difference. It was small, but it was real. As he hung up the phone, Malik stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the precinct grounds. It was still early in his tenure, and the challenges were far from over. But for the first time, Malik felt confident that the department was on the right path. And that was just the beginning.